Morning, welcome, Watershed. My name is Scott. I'm one of the pastors. I can't tell you how awesome it is to be in a space with you guys. I feel like it's just so, like we're going to lose it again, right? So you just kind of hold on to it and celebrate as much as possible and hope that that won't be the case. Thank you for coming out on a Sunday. Thank you for being vulnerable and entering a space. I know for so many of you, I met somebody today, again, it's only your third time here, or some of you it's your first time, that to walk into a space where we discuss things of spirituality and you allow yourself to be vulnerable and you stand and you sing, all these things, there's nothing necessarily easy or intuitive about that. But we want you to know that you are safe and we are grateful that you're here and we look forward to getting to know you. And you need to know that you mark us when you're here, when you're a part of what's going on. So thank you for this morning. So how many of you grew up, maybe like in the Northeast, the Midwest, the Northwest, where it's freezing cold in the winters? How many of you grew up in cold winters? Okay, yeah, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. And, we would have snow on Easter Sunday. It was so crazy in those days. And so I remember growing up, and then, of course, you get your license. And one of the first things you learn when you have a license in cold, crazy weather is, of course, you want to have make sure the fuel in your car is always, abundant because you never know if you get stuck somewhere. But then there's this other variable in terms of driving in crazy, snowy, blustery, cold Buffalo, New York weather. It's really important that you have a right amount of wiper fluid. And so you can be blaring down the road, as I was one holiday season coming back from Virginia. I went to school in Virginia, and I was coming back, I think it was like Thanksgiving or Christmas holiday. I'm driving my little beater pickup truck, and I'm driving down the road in the thruway, and all of a sudden I go to hit the spray button because you know what it's like when you're driving in a blustery snowstorm. The sort of dark, dirty spray from the road is coming up onto your windshield, and the windshield wipers sort of work for like a minute or two, then it gets dry and dirty, and you got to hit the sprayer, and everything was working great until I went to hit the sprayer, and it didn't work. So I thought, well, it must have frozen up, or I must maybe have run out of fluid. So I try to get off the next exit, and I'm having a hard time seeing where I'm going. I get off the exit and realize, no, the fluid is fine, but the compressor, the pump deal is frozen or broken, so it's not working. It's not spraying the fluid up onto the window, so it will clean it. So I get a couple gallons of fluid from the gas station, and I pour it on there, and a quart of it, whatever, and it cleans it all up for me. I take off down the road, and 4 or 5 minutes into my drive, of course, my windshield is all tainted. It's all dirty. It's grimy. I can't see. So I take the gallon of fluid and kind of weakly lean out over into the freezing cold weather and pour it onto the windshield because that's what you have to do in order to get home. And I knew if I could just plow through this probably in an hour or so, I'd be on the other side of the storm. And I'm going down the road 3 or 4 minutes later, I have to pull it out again, and keep on pouring this fluid onto the windshield, freezing my arm off, knowing it's the only way I'm going to actually be able to have any sense of what's in front of me. It's the only way I'm going to be able to clear the grid and the filter of all this film and all this grime on my windshield so that I can see where I'm going, so I can see what's out there. And what makes me so concerned, or what makes us so concerned about having a dirty windshield in driving conditions is that we don't know what's out there, right? That's what this series is about in essence, that we all have these biases. We all sit in front of a glass that is filtered and gridded and dirtied, and we're trying to do our best to figure out what is on that, because the other side of that glass might be this idea of truth, or this idea of what is real, or what is more real, or more true. And so we end up finding ourselves looking at these through these lenses and realizing, all right, maybe what I can do then is become aware of the dirt and the film and the grime that is on that window. We become aware of our biases. We become aware of the things that are hindering us from seeing reality. And that's what this series is about. It's about looking at the windshields in our lives and saying, all right, what are the variables that are keeping us away from seeing truth? What are the variables that early on in my life that kept me away from seeing LGBTQAI+ from the beautiful, honest way in which I needed to see them, but I didn't? I had to realize there was a bias there. I had to realize that there was a very dirty, filthy window that could not see humanity through that lens. What about Black Lives Matter? What about the way in which I see politics, and the way I see economics and my resources, and I see my time, and I see my children, and my spouse? I realize I have all these different grids and all these different biases with which how I interpret reality. And maybe what we're slated to do in a series like this is to step back and say, all right, I'm ready to take on a new understanding, a new awareness that helps me realize, wait, that is a bias that I have. I never knew it existed. Oh, wait a minute, that's another container that I need to sort of reestablish or rebuild. There's another filter or grid that I'm constantly having to clean up and to sort of clarify. And here's the reality of it. What happens is no matter how hard we try to clean the lens, the glass, the windshield, it's always tainted. You and I always have something filtering our ability to see reality. You understand that, right? You and I never fully sort of wake up. You can't be a news anchor that doesn't truly have a bias. It's always filtered. So the question becomes, well, are we keenly aware of those filters, and are we keenly aware of those biases, and what's that begin to look like? So in this series, this Pineapple Pizza series, we're trying to ask the question, what are those filters, what are those grids, and how do we become more aware of them? And if you're looking for a resource in this, there's a great podcast by Brian McLaren, Learning How to See, and highly recommended in terms of a resource. So when I say bias, many of you are like, well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, Scott. I mean, I understand the idea of a bias in particular, but you mean there's technical biases out there that we can identify with? Absolutely. There's tons of them, but there's a few of them that we might engage in this series, and the ones I'm going to read to you are not the ones necessarily that we're going to talk about, but some of them. There's one called confirmation bias. This is where the human brain welcomes information that confirms what it already thinks and resists information that disturbs or contradicts what it already thinks. You have community bias. The human brain finds it very hard for you to see something your group doesn't want you to see. We put the tribe over truth, right? That's a bias. There's complementary bias. If people are nice to you, you are open to what they see and have to say. If they aren't nice to you, you disengage them or disengage their idea. Conservative or liberal bias, right? We see this all the time. That our brains like to see as our party sees, and we flock with those who see as we do. These are some different biases that we navigate. There's one called confidence bias. Our brains prefer a confident lie to a hesitant truth. We mistake confidence for competence. And then lastly here, this one, competency bias. I think this is something every one of us contends with. Our brains tend to think of ourselves as above average. As a result, we are incompetent at knowing how competent or incompetent we actually are. These are just some of the biases out there. And as we begin to understand them and speak into them over the next several weeks, you'll hear from different people, different perspectives that will be hopefully very helpful in this. So I was looking at some of these biases, and one of them just jumped off the page at me. It's called this idea of complexity bias. And the idea of complexity bias is this. The complex, sophisticated concepts in our lives are perceived better than the ones which are more straightforward. In other words, we value sophisticated ideas over simple ones. That when somebody speaks through a complex lens, when they use big words, when they use a larger narrative, when they have different letters after their name, we somehow assume that the sophistication and the grandiosity of what is being stated or what is being written is more credible than if something is said more simply. That if something is lived out more simply. This is never more evident than in our love relationships. Your partner, your spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever the case might be. We invariably, when you are in love with somebody, when you're intimately or deeply connected with somebody, you definitely walk through imperfect times, right? Probably the last year and a half or so, COVID might have sort of stressed or pressed into that relationship. And invariably, you find yourself having difficult times and difficult seasons. That's any relationship worth its salt. And so what do we typically do? When our relationships are going a little bit sideways, we find ourselves maybe imbibing in a podcast, or we might read some books, or we might go to counseling, which I'm highly recommend. It's something that's a part of my life. We might go to a relationship conference. We might join a Facebook group. We might talk with other people who seemingly have been through all the same issues and challenges that we have found in our own relationship. We like to look for these areas that somehow, if somebody speaks long into them, if somebody speaks big into them, if somebody has some sort of expertise, then we listen, we dig deep for this sort of truth that helps us understand our relationship and where we would like it to go. Last month, in May 5th, my wife Taryn and I, the lady who was up here singing, she and I have celebrated 20 years of marriage. And we have 2 sons, and it's like any relationship, like any marriage, obviously it's got its challenges. And I will say the last couple of years have been incredibly difficult, the last year in particular, right? We've got 13 and 16-year-old sons who, they want to go to school, but instead they're staying home, and we're sort of pseudo kind of homeschool teachers via Zoom and all the nuances that's there. So that's incredibly stressful. About 6 weeks into the pandemic, our house was just decimated by 3 huge monstrous trees that came down on our home and flattened it. And so we spent 10 months or so living in different spaces, and the chaos of moving around during COVID was just crazy. It was a really difficult year. There was just challenges that we historically had not had to navigate. And so I try to think, all right, our 20-year anniversary, we got to do something a little bit different. We got to get out of Dodge. And it was just at that place in February where the hopes were that you could kind of travel. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. My wife has often talked about wanting to stay in a yurt. Now, I had no idea what a yurt was until I Googled it. And if you have any idea what a yurt is, it's really a fancy tent is all it basically is. So never stayed in one before, so I did a little bit of research, and I found one near Asheville, and I kind of planned this surprise trip for my wife, she and I, and just to get out away for a weekend. And so this was a couple weeks ago, and it just felt like no matter what we did, everything was so difficult. Everything was so challenging. We couldn't just get out of town. There was always some other variable, some nuance in terms of trying to get our boys to have somewhere to go, to my grandmother, her health was failing, so we were afraid to be away from town. It was the gas shortage that week, right? I was the guy driving around with 6 5-gallon containers of gas in my truck. I'm the reason there was a shortage. I get that. I'm a 6 on the Enneagram. I live in fear. I got to have all these things buttoned up. And so we had just enough gas to get to Charlotte, to Asheville, maybe go to Asheville one time for a meal, and then home. On our way to Asheville, finally got the kids dropped off, got enough gas in the vehicle. We're ready to go. We're driving out of town, and my mom calls and says, listen, your grandmother, my 95-year-old grandmother, she's not doing well. She took a turn for the worse. Just want to give you a heads up. I mean, I don't know if you want to, what you want to do. I just want to give you that heads up. And Taryn's like, we got to go back. So we're 40 miles down the road, burned, some gas. We head back and had this amazing, wonderful experience with some family members in the room and celebrated her when she was conscious with us. And they asked Taryn to sing some songs with her. It really had a meaningful time. Then Taryn and I went on and fortunately found some gas, got up there, and it was like this exhale. Here we are late. People are concerned, can we find the fuel? My wife is a vegetarian, so we found this vegetarian restaurant, really simple, really basic, really clean, nothing complicated. Really enjoyed the meal, enjoyed the conversation, and finally arrive at this yurt, and it's this really kind of cool. I think you got some pictures back there, guys. It's kind of this cool space, and we ended up just really enjoying our conversation, the meal. Next day, I was like, I don't really have anything planned for us. I just wanted to get out of town, and we found a place where we went hiking, and then my wife's into these. All these plants and all this kind of stuff. And so we drove around to different plant places and looked at plants and got some really good Indian takeout that night, and then a couple glasses of wine on the porch, and just found ourselves really enjoying each other's company. Nobody was asking us for anything. Our phones weren't ringing. Our kids weren't vying for our attention. There was any drama happening. We got up the next morning. We went out for some brunch before we headed back to Charlotte and the reality that is Charlotte. And in that moment, in the beauty and the simplicity of a tent, yurt, food without meat, takeout, like in that simplicity of all of that, it was like this, oh, wait a minute, I just rediscovered who I married 20 years earlier. Oh, yes, that's right. We can just have good conversation, and it doesn't have to be so weighted, it doesn't have to be so efficient because we've got kids who are going to be waking up in 10 minutes. We found ourselves really just, at least I did, really connecting and saying, this is why I'm with this person after 20 years. I love who she is. I love all these different variables. And it was a wonderful time just to be together, and not have to plan something complex. It was actually the simple. And what I'm learning in relationships is we often think we've got to jump through all these hoops, but maybe actually it's as simple as just being together. It's disengaging the noise around and being around each other. In terms of complexity bias, when it comes to health, this is something huge for people, for myself, all of us included. You start talking about your health, there's all these kinds of conversations. Well, what kind of diet is it? Is it keto? Is it low carb? Is it low calorie? Do you have a trainer? Do you have a gym membership? Do you have an online workout subscription? Do you have fancy Lululemon clothing, workout gear? Do you have a tattoo that inspires you to work out? Do you have what kind of watch do you wear so that you can check your steps and you can do all these things? Maybe you bought a treadmill. I had 2 neighbors recently that had bought treadmills a few years back, put them in the basement, like everybody else, never used them. And then they're trying to get them out of the basement. They had to pay somebody to take them apart, to bring them out of the basement, to give them away. And it would create all this noise around how we see health. That maybe the simplicity is actually saying, well, I have this couple that walks in front of our house every day. And they live in Plaza Midwood. My wife and I, we live on 5th Street. So it's a good little walk. And every day they walk, and they're probably in their 70s or so, and sometimes I see them twice a day, and they're having great conversation. You can tell there's a gait to their walk. They're taking it very seriously, and they're being together, and they're trim, and you can tell like there's something about how they see reality. It's really simple. And I've been reading this guy who talks about what it means to be healthy, and he says really simply, you eat a lot of vegetables, eat a little bit of lean meat, and you walk. You move, he says. And it's about as simple as that. And so what do we do when it comes to health? We look at all these sophisticated things as opposed to the small things. Why is it that we value sophistication over the simple? I think it's a control thing, right? I mean, after all, it's easy to download an app. So at least I've done something. I've downloaded the app, right? It's easy to check my steps so I can at least look at my watch. It's easy to say, well, I've read a book on how I should eat, so at least I'm having some variable of control. And I think it's why the complexity bias for many of us is how we lean into more sophisticated narrative than baseline simple narrative. This might be the most true in religiosity, right? We love sophistication in the religious space. We love degrees on our walls and tomes of books on our shelves that articulate all this assumption about faith in God and all these nuances. I remember my first church job, I was on staff with a guy who was an academic. He was brilliant. And he would take me to these conferences, these academic conferences where a bunch of old stodgy people would stand up and literally read for 30 minutes at a time white papers on some minuscule nuance related to theology and doctrine. And most of the time I wouldn't be able to follow half of it because it was so sophisticated, it was so elegant, it was so well said that I just could not understand it. I didn't necessarily live in that space intellectually like he did. But then afterwards we'd go out and we'd talk about it. And they would spend all this energy on these very small nuances that apparently were God. In all of it, there was this debate happening at these conferences. It was splitting these sort of groups of people into 2 different factions. And this conversation was around this narrative called open theism. And open theism is a real simple word phrase that basically means that we have the ability to change God's mind. And there's scripture that somehow alludes to this. There's the Job passage, there's some Moses passage that invariably argues that the narrative reflects that these guys asked for nuances changed of God, and God made the change, and God shifted, and therefore they changed God's mind. And so there was a split down the middle that could we actually change God's mind? Because if we change God's mind, that means then there's no trajectory that's for sure. And so the debate was going on within these academic factions, and they were splitting down the middle. People were being thrown out, all based in this idea that somehow we could or could not change God's mind. Now I step back at 51 and ask the question, who cares, number one? Number two, do we have any idea that we really can do that? Do we think that we really know what it means to change God's mind, or if God even has a mind, right? Or if God is even rational in terms of how they engage reality? It's how we come to it. And so we debate, we spend all this time, we attempt to give you all these filters and all these grids and all these hoops that you have to jump through. And if you don't jump through them appropriately, if you don't do the work, if you don't sign up and jump into all the things that the church and that religiosity asks you to do, then somehow you're not living this right life. And somehow you're living it in a wrong fashion. That religion can tell us all the truths we don't want to hear, but it can tell us the truths we want to hear as well. It can keep the illusion alive, in a sense. Because if I don't understand all of it, and I'm playing with all these podcasts and books and showing up at all the right things and signing all the right deals and showing up to the right Zoom classes and doing all these things, then somehow I might arrive at some place of, oh, now God and I, it's all good. And we keep on jumping into more complicated things as opposed to maybe imbibing God in the most simple and the most baseline. So is it possible that we take God, I don't want to say too seriously because I don't know if it probably comes out wrong, but that sometimes we elevate God to be something that they never intended or longed or wanted us to be. So then, Scott, to you, who is God? If I can give if I could take and bring it down to the most baseline assumption as to who God is, and I'm calling it an assumption, is that the essence of the God that I think is out there, that I believe is out there, this essence, this Christ, we might call it in some traditions, this movement, this energy, at some point breathed, created all what we know into existence, or at least a chunk of it. And then the system kept self-creating. Also, an assumption I can make about this essence is that not only did they create, or did they maybe birth into existence what this is, but the reason why I think something is behind what's happening here is because you can look out to the scenery. You can look out to, I saw the sunset last night. I've got this cool plant that my family gave me for my birthday, this bonsai little tree kind of deal. It takes me back to the 80s with, the Karate Kid kind of thing. And it's sitting there in my office at home. And I looked at that this morning, like, there's something beautiful about that deal. There's this flower that my wife is growing out back. I don't know the name of it, but it just started budding, and it's beautiful. It's this orange, beautiful flower. And something that created that cared about it. Right? The music this morning, the poetry this morning, the relationships in the space. There's something that's behind all of that. And is it possible that this essence, that this God is behind that, and that because this God creates that kind of beauty, is it worth pursuing? Are they worth pursuing? I think so. That's about the sort of the totalitarian of my understanding of what I would argue God to be. And we can go off into other tangents, which is fine, but those are metaphors. Those are containers, just like what I shared with you are containers. But maybe what we need to do, maybe the role that we get to play here at Watershed in part, is to take the complex and make it simple. That what it means for us to engage God is about the simplicity, not about the sophistication. That maybe we get to reclaim God in a way, and I know David's doing some of this with his reclamation block right now on God, that maybe we get to make God more about a unifying factor as opposed to a disunifying factor, right? So the more complicated we get in terms of religiosity, we create denominations, we create different containers, we create whole different religious systems. And those systems get in the way of us being able to maybe be free and experience what it means to engage each other and have a simplicity to life. In part, this is what we do in preface. If you haven't been here before very long, and you haven't heard us talk about preface, it's something we highly recommend you do. Matt just talked about it a minute ago. We do it for 3 weeks right now. And it's where we get together and we sort of take all the noise and the energy of religiosity, and Christianity in particular, and we begin to try to simplify it and try to give you filters and lenses so that you have the ability to say, all right, here's what I'm experiencing right now. Here's what's going on right now. And what do I take in and what do I let go? It's sort of like when Jesus was walking down the road and a bunch of people were vying for his attention. And there was this dude on the side of the road, this blind guy, and the blind man's crying out for Jesus. Hey, Jesus, Jesus. And the people are saying, no, don't disrupt him right now. He's got too much going on. Jesus hears him and he says, well, what is it you need? He says, well, I'm blind and I want to see. And so Jesus heals him, and the story says he can then see. But just because Jesus healed his ability to see does not mean he could tell him how to see. That's the beauty of what we get to have, right? There's this freedom. You've been wired to be free to choose how you see reality. You've been wired to be aware that you have filters that get in the way of how you and I see reality, that we have complex grids, that we enjoy the complexity, but often those complex narratives, they keep us from really being able to enjoy who we are the way God maybe wired us to. So my grandmother, 95 years old, she did pass several days later. We got a chance to spend a little bit more time with her even after that weekend. And so Millie Burgess, my grandmother, is 95 years old. She passed 15, 16 years ago when we started Watershed. She was one of our core team members. And she was a part of what made this place happen. And so at my grandmother's funeral a week ago Friday, people stood up and people shared, as they do in funerals. And it was an amazing celebration of a woman that had a wonderful life. And when we talked about Grandma Burgess, we didn't talk about her sophisticated painting. She's an immense artist. She was great at painting, and she was into China painting. And so she would do these. All of us have like these edifices in our home to Grandma Burgess, where all these things she's painted over the years, and these small little paintings, these large paintings, and they're all done beautifully, all by hand. And I remember when I was like my late 20s, all my brothers, my family and friends were getting married, and my grandparents were making China painted up plates for everybody, because that's what you get when you get married. You get China paintings, right? Or you get China plates. And so they painted them for everybody. And I hadn't married Taryn yet, nor had we even met. And so I was single. I said, would you please give me a set of plates, even though I don't have anybody to share them with yet? And they did. And so I've got this beautiful set of plates that Grandpa Burgess hand painted for me 20-some years ago. And over the years, she's continued this. So she's got this complex, sophisticated way of painting, and she's a beautiful artist. Is that what we talked about? No. What do we talk about? Well, what's it like for this person in Grandma to be a grandmother? What was she like as a spouse? What was she like as a parent? That every Christmas, most of you who would know Millie Burgess would receive a small little tin of handmade cookies that she had baked weeks earlier in preparation for the season. Probably if you had any association with her, you were invited into her home, and she would make a wonderful meal so that people could connect. She loved her coffee, and she would often say, well, come on over, let's have a cup of coffee. And people began to talk about what it meant to know, what it means to know her, meant to know her, in terms of these meaningful engagements they had. Was it the complexity of her artwork that they talked about? No. Was it how she kept a home or a checkbook, or how she attended church services? No. She was known by the way she connected with people. It was the simple ways, not the complex ways. And so for us to move from complexity to simplicity in our relationships, and how we connect with faith, and how we connect with God, and how we deal with resources, what does that mean? The irony of it is, it's actually harder to live in the way of the simplicity than it is the way of the complexity, because we can't control the simple as often. We can control the complicated. And so the work that we get to do is to challenge you, to challenge ourselves, that what does it mean to move in this complexity bias from the difficult to the basic, from the sophisticated to the beautifully elegant? What does it mean to engage God in this way? What does it mean to engage each other this way? And what does it mean to engage our faith journey? So let's pray. So Father, I'm grateful for this community. I'm grateful for the way it challenges itself, for how we ask really hard questions, for the ability that we're sort of ready to let things go at different times. I see that happening all the time here, where there's this, we have whole swaths of assumptions about you, containers and grids of how we think you operate in our lives. And we've let so much of that go. We've deconstructed so much of that way. And now we are finding ourselves reclaiming these really clean, maybe more simple ways of saying, well, what does it mean to connect with you, God? And so we connect with you in relationship with other people. We connect with you in singing out songs that give metaphor to how we might think you to be, or how we might think you to be in connection with us. We look forward to these days ahead. We look forward to this month, this Pride Month, and how we get to be allies and celebrate our brothers and our sisters and our siblings We love you, Father. Thanks for our time this morning.